The American Story, The Beginnings, by David Barton and Tim Barton, as read by Karl Hirsch. The American Story highlights some of the interesting moments and people that reveal God's providence in America. We have a fascinating history that must be remembered and passed on to future generations.
Section 2, the Colonial Period. Chapter 3, Colonial Pastors in Public Affairs, as well as Chapter 4, the American Witch Trials. Throughout the 1600s, Christian leaders had a significant positive influence on civil and government advances, helping secure both civil and religious liberty. For example, in 1619, the Reverend William Wickham served in Virginia's original General Assembly, the first elected governing body in America. 1620, Elder William Brewster applied the teachings of Pilgrim pastor John Robinson to create Plymouth Colony's Mayflower Compact, the first governing document written in America. In 1636, 6 ministers helped found Harvard, the first successful college in America. Also in 1636, the Reverend Roger Williams and Reverend John Clark founded the colony of Rhode Island. In 1639, the Reverend Thomas Hooker and the Reverend John Davenport founded the colony of Connecticut, and Hooker helped produce the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the first constitution written in America. In 1641, Reverend Nathaniel Ward wrote the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which included the first Bill of Rights in America. In 1681, Quaker minister William Penn founded Pennsylvania and wrote its Frame of Government. In 1692, the Reverend John Wise and the Reverend Increase Mather helped establish due process rights in the judicial system. The Reverend John Wise. He was a pastor in the rural town of Ipswich, Massachusetts. Although few today are familiar with him, distinguished professor of history Clinton Rossiter, one of the best students of the era, considered Wise one of the 6 most influential persons in shaping the American thinking that led to independence. Incidentally, 4 of the 6 Rossiter identified were clergymen. In addition to the Reverend Wise's vast intellect and deep biblical knowledge, he was also a man of great physical strength, known throughout the area as a skilled and powerful wrestler. Even as his hair grayed and his physical frame diminished with age, he remained a venerable figure. Late in Wise's life, a youthful John Chandler, a ship captain and a master wrestler of the Andover community, across the bay from Ipswich, came to Wise's home and challenged him to a wrestling match. Pastor Wise declined on account of his old age, but Chandler persisted until Wise finally agreed. Only seconds after the match began, Wise grabbed the young Chandler, lifted him above his head, and tossed him completely over the front wall of his yard. Thoroughly embarrassed, Chandler quickly got to his feet, regained his dignity, brushed himself off, and in good humor informed the Reverend Wise that he would be on his way back to Andover just as soon as Pastor Wise threw his horse over the wall after him. Those who knew the Reverend Wise believed him to be as strong in his spiritual prayer life as in his physical prowess. One Sunday after pirates kidnapped a local boat crew, the Reverend Wise offered a prayer for the captured men, a prayer punctuated with a manly plea. "Great God, if there is no other way, may they rise and butcher their enemies." The next day, the captured boat crew, having risen and butchered their enemies, returned safely to town, thus affirming to the community the efficacy of Wise's prayers. His sermons were just as powerful as his prayers, and he preached numerous profound messages. As early as 1687, nearly a century before the American War for Independence, he was already teaching that taxation without representation is tyranny. The consent of the people is the foundation of government. And every man must be acknowledged equal to every man. Interesting, there are very similar thoughts in the Declaration of Independence, including imposing taxes on us without our consent, the consent of the governed, and all men are created equal. There is good reason for the striking similarity between the language of the Declaration and that used generations earlier by the Reverend Wise. In 1772, with the American War for Independence looming on the horizon, leading patriots from Massachusetts reprinted two of Wise's works to remind their fellow citizens of the core biblical principles of government. The list of patriots who helped publish Wise's ideas to bring them to the independence-minded citizens of their generation is impressive. It includes distinguished names such as political leaders: Timothy Pickering, who was a U.S. Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of War; Moses Gill, Governor of Massachusetts; and Samuel Eliot, a Massachusetts judge. Military leaders: Artemus Ward and Jedediah Huntington, generals during the War for Independence; and Joshua Loring, a naval officer. Educators: Tapping Reeve, who was the founder of the first law school in America; Eleazar Wheeler, founder of Dartmouth; Samuel Stillman and Isaac Backus, founders of Brown University; and Jeremy Belknap, noted historian. Noted patriots: William Dawes, who rode with Paul Revere as part of that famous midnight ride to warn patriots of the approaching British forces; Samuel Gore, one of the Indians in the Boston Tea Party; and Ebenezer Dorr. Ministers: Benjamin Bach, an early chaplain of the Continental Navy; and Manasseh Cutler, congressman and primary author of the famous Northwest Ordinance. These American luminaries helped publish Wise's works so his ideas could be distributed among the people by the Sons of Liberty and other leading patriots. The first printing sold so quickly that a second was issued. Historians in later generations noted some of the most glittering sentences in the immortal Declaration of Independence are almost literal quotations from this essay of John Wise. It was used as a political textbook in the great struggle for freedom. When President Calvin Coolidge delivered a speech in 1926 on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, he acknowledged, "These thoughts in the Declaration can very largely be traced back to what John Wise was writing in 1710. His works were reprinted in 1772 and have been declared to have been nothing less than a textbook of liberty for our revolutionary fathers." But Wise did more than just advocate biblical principles of civil liberty. He also stood boldly in their defense. While Wise was pastoring, Britain's King James II sent Edmund Andros to be governor over all the colonies of New England, including Massachusetts. When Andros arrived in 1686, he tried to seize the charters of 8 New England colonies: Connecticut, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Rhode Island, New York, New Hampshire, East Jersey, and West Jersey, revoke the representative governments, and force them into a single unified colony under his control. And even though they were very religiously diverse, he also tried to force the British Anglican Church upon them all. Wise was a key leader in opposing Andros's effort. For example, when Andros attempted to unilaterally impose taxes upon the people by completely bypassing their elected legislative representatives, Wise spoke out forcefully against the plan and organized resistance to it. In response, Andros arrested Wise, removed him from his pastorate, imprisoned him, and imposed a hefty fine on him. Judge Joseph Dudley, an ally of Andros, then held Wise in prison, refusing Wise's lawful right of habeas corpus. Now, habeas corpus is Latin for "you shall have the body." It is a legal order requiring a prisoner to be physically, that is, in the body, brought before a judge. This right ensures that individuals cannot be unlawfully jailed or wrongly imprisoned, such as for a non-criminal, politically motivated arrest, unless charges are brought against them. If charges are pressed, the accused then has a right to a fair and speedy trial. Governor Andros arrogantly ignored these biblically informed common law practices. King James II, who had sent Andros to America, was removed from the throne by the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It was called glorious because not only was there little bloodshed, but it also led to the establishment of significant constitutional rights. With James II removed, Boston residents arrested the heavy-handed Andros and sent him back to England. Wise was then elected to help organize the government, and he then sued Judge Dudley for refusing his right of habeas corpus, winning a large economic settlement against him. Wise was a consistent and unflinching voice for freedom, boldly proclaiming that every individual is, quote, a freeborn subject under the crown of heaven, and owing homage, that is, tribute and service, to none but God himself, end quote. This was a revolutionary teaching at that time, but Wise forcefully asserted it not just for the state, but also for the church. Thus, when a plan was advanced to remove local church control and place it in the hands of a small council of elite ministers, he not only fiercely resisted, but almost single-handedly defeated the effort. Because so many of the key ideas the Founding Fathers used in writing the Declaration of Independence and fighting British tyranny originated in Wise's town of Ipswich, the town is known as the birthplace of American independence. Thus, the Reverend John Wise, through his writings, sermons, and bold leadership, helped found free governments in colonial America, as well as lay the philosophical and intellectual basis for American independence. Shortly after Andros was removed and order was restored to the region, the infamous Salem witch trials of 1691 to 1692 occurred, in which 27 individuals died. This is one of the rare occasions when the New England Puritans fell into the same type of bad behavior from which they had fled. And just as the Reverend Wise had been key in ending the British tyranny in that day, so too he was instrumental in ending this American tyranny. There is no defense for these trials. Nevertheless, a significant question to ask is, why did the trials stop after only 27 deaths? After all, witch trials were occurring across the old world at the time, trials that resulted in 500,000 deaths in Europe, including 30,000 in England, 75,000 in France, 100,000 in Germany. Additionally, the European trials lasted for decades, while the American trials lasted just 18 months. Thus, comparatively speaking, America, even with its failures, was still quite advanced when compared to Europe. But why were there fewer deaths in American trials, and why did the trials end more quickly? The American trials were brought to a close because Christian leaders such as the Reverend John Wise, the Reverend Increase Mather, and Thomas Brattle confronted the civil leaders. They pointed out that the rules of evidence and due process set forth in the Bible were not being followed in the courts, thus convincing civil officials to end those trials. What are some of those biblical policies for achieving justice? One answer comes from modern Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. Although one of the most secular-minded justices in Supreme Court history, he nonetheless openly acknowledged that, quote, "The right of an accused to meet his accusers face to face is mentioned in, among other things, the Bible," end quote. Breyer cites Federal Practices and Procedure, Federal Rules of Evidence, which devotes more than 20 pages to the ways the Bible directly shaped several of the due process protections that became incorporated into the Federal Bill of Rights. In many European countries at that time, due process rights ranged from non-existent to far behind those in New England. For example, in specialty courts in England such as admiralty courts, courts of high commission, and courts of Star Chamber, it was often the case that 1. The same individual served as judge, prosecutor, and jury with no checks and balances. 2. An individual charged with any crime whatsoever was always assumed to be guilty of that crime. There was no innocent until proven guilty, which is the traditional basis of the American criminal justice system. 3. A person could be charged with a crime without the accuser ever being known. Those making the accusations were kept secret and hidden, and for the accused to confront the accuser was not permitted. 4. Hearsay evidence, that is, gossip and rumor, was accepted as fact. 5. Attorneys could not offer a defense. 6. An individual could be forced to give testimony against himself, and torture could be used to secure a self-incriminating confession. All of these biblical practices violated biblical standards. Therefore, biblically informed Puritan spiritual leaders pointed out to the civil leaders conducting the witch trials that the procedures used in the trials were wrong. Here is an excerpt from noted historian William Warren Sweet in his book, The Story of American Religion, that tells what happened when the ministers showed the civil leaders what they did wrong. The trials were stopped by Governor Phipps in October 1692, and 5 years later the Massachusetts court publicly repented and set apart a special day of fasting and prayer, that prayers might be offered asking for forgiveness for the, quote, late tragedy raised amongst us by Satan, end quote. Accepting insufficient evidence against the accused. And Judge Sewell rose in his pew in the South Church and made public confession of his sense of guilt. Not only were the trials ended, but the families of the accused received restitution, and their names exonerated. Sadly, many modern texts are quick to point out the 27 deaths that occurred under the Puritans, but ignore the hundreds of thousands of deaths committed in Europe. As early historian Daniel Dorchester noted, a knowledge of the actual facts, quote, should moderate our denunciations and charges of severity, brutality, and narrow-mindedness against the colonial forefathers who, it clearly appears, were much in advance of their times, end quote. Offering additional evidence to prove that point, he continued, when the Mayflower left England in 1620, 31 offenses were punishable with death in the mother country. By the middle of that century, the 1650s, the blacklist had enlarged to 223, of which 176 were without the benefit of the clergy. How far in advance the New England colonies were is evident from the fact that not a single American colony code recognized more than 15 capital crimes. It is undeniable that heinous acts occurred in early America, sometimes at the hands of Christians. However, Because the positive influence that came from the widespread knowledge of the Bible among both citizens and leaders, America not only had far fewer atrocities than other nations, but also contributed more good than any other nation at that time or since.